Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, another hostage video released and new revelations about how Gazans feel about Hamas. Plus, a look at President-elect Trump's cabinet picks. What could they mean for Israel and the Middle East? And the new book, Stand Up Nation. Gordon Robertson talks with author Aviva Kompas about Israel's commitment to help other nations. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. In their Oval Office meeting this week, President Biden and President-elect Trump agreed to work together to free the hostages in Gaza. Meanwhile, explosive reports have emerged. One shows Hamas is also torturing citizens of Gaza, and another indicates that 12 principals of UNRWA schools in Gaza were active members of terror organizations. Here's the latest on these developments and more, plus a warning. Some of the video you're about to see is disturbing. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, paraphrasing President Biden, said he's ready to do everything in our collective American power to secure the release of the hostages. Yet not all the hostages in Gaza are held by Hamas. Palestinian Islamic Jihad released a propaganda video of their hostage, Sasha Trufano. Trufano's mother viewed the video with mixed emotions.
On the one hand, I am very happy to see him alive and see him talking. And on the other hand, I see that he is not in a good mental or physical state.
Inside Gaza, Israeli forces released hundreds of hours of closed-circuit television footage. The IDF said the materials expose how Hamas brutally tortured Palestinian civilians suspected of opposing its rule. Some were hung upside down, others tied up in agonizing positions, or tortured while their captors sat inches away, talking to themselves or completing paperwork. Israeli media details the anger many Gazans feel towards Hamas. An Israeli Channel 12 reporter got exclusive access into Gaza and heard this unfiltered view from a number of its citizens.
رفعتي صوتك ضد حماس شو بده يكون؟
بيقتلونا إرهابية حماس إرهابية قولوا يلا معي حماس إرهابية حماس إرهابية الله ينتقم منك يا سنوار الله يشحمك يا رب أبرك.
The video showed IDF soldiers providing water and medical aid.
اشتبه بدهم يساعدوك اوكي؟ اوكي؟
تخافيش يا خال تخافيش وانت الله يقطع حماس واليوم اللي شفناهم فيه ذبحوهم ذبحوا حماس وقتلوهم وين ما رحتوا شفتوهم اذبحوهم ينعوا ابوهم ما بدناش اياهم يحلوا عنا.
A number of men on crutches explains how they were wounded.
كل هدول المشلولين اللي بشوف كلهم من حماس؟ حاول افهم شيء. اسرائيل يعني بتسمح لهدول الشاحنات يفوتوا على الشمال
بسرقوها
حماس بيسرقوها
اظن ميت من الجوع احسن
امام عيونكم سرقوها
اظن ميت قدام علي تكلمت اذا تكلمت بطخوك وين بخلطك بخطوك هان وين بطخها بطخ شحان على اللحم بطخ عشان يشلك.
Many said they favored Israel.
حماس عن الوجود احنا معكم
انتوا معنا يعني انتوا مع اسرائيل؟
مع اسرائيل خيرنا منكم احنا جوز ما يدخل عندكم انتوا الخير عندكم انتوا البركه ها
The report also noted hundreds of Hamas terrorists have been surrendering, a sign of how much the IDF has weakened the terror group. The U.S. has reportedly given Lebanon a draft plan for a ceasefire with Israel, according to Reuters. And according to the Wall Street Journal, that came after the president-elect signed off on a ceasefire proposal while meeting with Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer at Mar-a-Lago. For months, Israel has operated with a limited arms embargo by the Biden administration. But Trump has announced on day one of his administration he will remove all restrictions and delays on transferring weapons and combat equipment to Israel. However, that promise may be tied to a ceasefire deal, and there are still reportedly key disagreements to be worked out, including Israel's ability to strike Hezbollah if necessary. Some in Israel have been insisting in recent days that Israel must be able to protect itself.
We will not have any ceasefire, we will not stop, and we will not take our foot off the gas.
The military campaign will continue until the immediate threat from Lebanon is removed and residents of our north can return safely to their homes in sovereign Israeli territory. Israel will not accept the existence of a terrorist military array on our northern border. We know what their intent is. It's to harm our people. Hezbollah's Conquer the Galilee plan, it made very clear, an invasion and massacre on a larger scale than the October 7th massacre.
For now, the war against Hezbollah has expanded to Syria, where it manufactures weapons for Hezbollah.
We will attack any attempt to transfer weapons from Syria to Hezbollah, and we will attack any infrastructure we identify in Syria that is intended to produce weapons for Hezbollah.
The IDF also attacked the military headquarters of Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Damascus, and it released intelligence of an extensive military infrastructure Hezbollah built along Israel's border. The infrastructure was designed to launch an even greater attack on northern Israeli towns than Hamas did on October 7th. And in the war against Hamas in the south, hundreds of terrorist fighters have either surrendered or been eliminated. Given Israel's progress, many are now considering what comes next when the war in Gaza is over. Reportedly, Israel plans a long-term presence in Gaza to gather intelligence, operate where needed, establish a border buffer zone, and crush the Hamas military entirely. And a new report identified 12 principals of UNRWA schools are active members of terror organizations. Many of them held high-level positions in their terror units. This report contradicts the claims by UNRWA that it is committed to tolerant and anti-extremist education. Coming up, President Trump makes his appointments. What will his picks mean for Israel? John Waggy, great to be with you. President Trump has been making lots of news. One of the big news over here is his appointment of the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Governor Mike Huckabee. When you heard that, what was your reaction?
My reaction was, sounds like a home run, really, because we know Mike Huckabee from years of his coming here and doing interviews with CBN News. He knows Israel inside and out. He's led tours here. He's been here many, many times. He loves Israel. He knows Israel. And as we saw in a recent interview, he's not afraid to say it the way he believes it, which is this is not occupied land, the West Bank, Judea, Samaria. This is the promised land, promised from the Bible. And being a former Baptist minister, he's aware of what the Scripture says about this land and what the promises are for this land way into the future when the Messiah comes and reigns here for 1,000 years. So that's what he brings to the table, and it's going to be, I think, a refreshing change from the kind of back and forth of, yes, we have an ironclad commitment to Israel, but you have to let us defend you. You can't defend yourself against attacks. That kind of thinking is, you know, was part and parcel of the Biden administration, and I think it's going away even sooner than the Biden administration actually leaves. Yeah, and as President Trump said, from day one on his presidency, he's going to remove any arms embargo or slow walking many of these munitions. In what other ways do you think there's going to be a difference between what we've seen in the last 4 years and what we're going to see in the next? Well, just the whole appointment policy. It doesn't end with Mike Huckabee. I mean, you got Elise Stefanik at the United Nations. She's going to be one of the most vocal Israel supporters that we've had there. You've got Pete Hegseth with the Department of Defense, who's a strong Israel supporter. You've got Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, who actually takes some of the Yigal Carmon was telling us he takes memory postings and puts them out on social media. So we're talking about people who have a very solid, very deep understanding of what's really going on behind the scenes and what can truly lead to peace in the Middle East. And that's one of the most exciting parts about it, I think, is that most of these the people who have been appointed are believers, and believers in Yeshua, and also strong believers in the Judeo-Christian ethic. And I think the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And I think that is going to inform their policy going forward. And that's a huge, huge change. We've never seen it across the board with that kind of completeness that it seems to be indicating from the administration. We'll have to wait and see, because sometimes President Trump himself has been, well, a Palestinian state might be a good idea, you know, but not at this time, certainly, you know. And so he's approaching that cautiously. We'll have to see who else is involved in the makeup of administration policy to know whether we're going straight down the path of a whole different paradigm that pushes the Oslo Accords clear off the table, basically.
And one other thing that might be on the table will be David Friedman's idea. He wrote a book called One Jewish State, and part of that is the sense that, well, maybe we should declare sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, known as the West Bank, which would be a win-win, he believes, both Palestinians and Israelis. Yeah, and that's still a tough sell, even within the Israeli population. The idea that they could get the Arabs to agree to a one Jewish state is pretty novel still. It's still very much in its infancy in terms of policy because of the Oslo Accords dominating for the last 30 years. But if people can start to look at it from a new perspective, and I know you did a story recently on Palestinians who were expressing just sheer rage through an Israeli television channel against Hamas. That's right. And if there's a different outlook from among the people of Gaza, among the people in Judea and Samaria, we might be ready for a world that President Trump calls a golden era coming ahead. But a lot of pitfalls still is still in the way. Yeah, and a lot of people will be praying for all of this to unfold. Absolutely, for great wisdom. Amen. Thank you, John. Thanks, Chris.
Still ahead, Tikkun Olam, Healing the World. A new book outlines Israel's resolve to be a blessing.
In the face of so much adversity and a war on 7 fronts, you wouldn't think Israel could put much effort or resources into assisting other countries. Surprisingly, the opposite is true. CBN President Gordon Robertson interviewed Aviva Kompas, the author of a new book, Stand Up Nation, who says that Israel is very much engaged in helping people around the world. Here's his interview segment from CBN's The 700 Club.
Well, the nation of Israel has faced continual threats since its founding back in 1948. Despite ongoing wars, the Jewish state has thrived. It's also been a source of help for other nations in their times of need. Stand Up Nation is a new book that tells how Israelis are sending humanitarian aid and sharing their expertise with countries around the world.
In the early hours of October 7th, Israel faced one of the most brutal attacks in its history. Shockwaves from that day touched the depths of Israel's soul while igniting a storm of grief, fear, and uncertainty. In this time of death and darkness, a profound resilience began to rise. Aviva Kompas, author of Stand Up Nation, takes readers on a journey through the lives of unsung heroes and ordinary Israelis living extraordinary lives. Her book captures Israel's indomitable spirit and the heart and grit of a people who, even in the face of terror, refuse to be broken. It's a testament to Israel's strength, not just as a country, but as a family that stands together. Forged from decades of adversity, tragedy, and enemies seeking their destruction, Israelis' determination has become legendary. Through powerful stories of courage and unity, this former UN speechwriter reveals how hope, faith, and the will to stand up allow Israelis to rise again and again.
Kompas also celebrates Israel's history and the Jewish principle of tikkun olam, healing the world. Today, that humanitarian aid includes helping war refugees seeking shelter on a Greek island, to providing wells to an African village, bringing life-giving water, all in an effort to help heal our suffering world. It's an amazing, often untold story, now revealed.
Well, Stand Up Nation author Aviva Kompas joins us now from our CBN News Bureau. Welcome to the 700 Club. It's a joy to have you with us.
It's such an honor. Thank you so much.
Well, let's talk about Israel's history. It seems to be incredible. Here's the nation the size of New Jersey. It seems to be punching well above its weight in terms of offering humanitarian aid around the world. Why is that such a seemingly well-kept secret?
That's exactly the question that I had, which is, why is this great story of Israel an untold story of Israel? So I used to serve as the speechwriter for Israel's delegation to the United Nations, and I was writing speeches on a huge array of topics that the UN covers: peace and security, economics, women's rights, and so on and so forth. But when it came to writing about international development and humanitarian aid, I found myself captivated when I was learning about the early story of Israel. It has this really remarkable situation where Israel itself is a developing country for its first 10 years, and it's in the context of this country being desperately poor, being a nation that is fighting existential wars against its neighbors. It's a nation made up of Holocaust survivors, refugees from Arab lands. Its economy is tanking. It is not the land of milk and honey as described in the Bible. It is dry, it is arid, and it's in this context that Israel goes and founds an international development agency. Israel, this tiny, poor country, has an international development agency before the United States, before Canada, before the UN has its development program, and I wanted to tell the story of how that came to be.
So your book goes into some of the quotes from Israel's leaders in history as to why, and those quotes really reverberated with me. It just seemed to be a national obligation that somehow if we don't do this, we're going to be missing out. What's the background to that?
So what happens is that Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, he appoints Golda Meir to be the first foreign minister. This is in 1956, so it's just 8 years after Israel is founded. And Golda Meir, as the foreign minister, is looking around the world, and she sees that it's a country that is diplomatically and politically isolated. It does not have a lot of friends in the world, a situation not unfamiliar to what is happening today. As I said, it's desperately poor. It's a country of refugees. The government has to institute austerity measures that are basically rationing basic goods. And Golda Meir says, I need to change this situation. And she's looking around at the context of the international community, and she's looking at the continent of Africa. Now, at this time, waves of decolonization are spreading across Africa. Country after country gains its independence and goes on to join the United Nations. So Golda Meir decides to go and take a tour through a number of newly founded African nations. And she goes, and what she discovers is that there's a situation very similar to Israel. The countries are new, they're emerging from under the thumb of colonialism, they're dry, they're arid, they're poor. Golda Meir goes to David Ben-Gurion and she says, the context is the same, but here's the difference. I am absolutely certain that Israel is going to transform itself into a prosperous nation, and in the process of doing so, I want us to lift up these other nations by sharing what we have. We don't have money, but what we have is knowledge, and we have what you're describing, audacity or chutzpah.
Well, what's the impact of that? You were at the UN. It seems to me that either the countries don't know about the aid that they've received from Israel, but it just seems like every time the General Assembly votes, it tends to vote against Israel. Well, why is that? Why isn't there gratitude for what has happened?
You're absolutely right. Every fall when we're at the General Assembly, we see that country after country votes against Israel over and over again. The same at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. One of the reasons is that Israel has never made it contingent. The aid is not contingent on political favors or UN votes. It's a true act of generosity to be able to do it. And I think that it's a reasonable question to ask about whether these countries should be showing greater reciprocity and favorability towards Israel.
Up next, more from Gordon Robertson's 700 Club interview with author Aviva Kompas.
Let's look at just recent history. Since October 7th, is the same fire to help the world, is that still there in Israeli society, or is there an inclination to pull back? And maybe it's too soon after Amsterdam to really answer, but are people feeling that they might actually be at risk in going to other countries to extend humanitarian aid?
What we've seen in the last 14 months since the absolute atrocities of October 7th is something that I don't think we'll see again in our lifetime. We're living through something that's a truly remarkable period of history, not just for Israel and for the Jewish people, but really for the entire world. And you can see that in the way that this war is being played out, as you said, on the streets of Amsterdam and Antwerp and New York City and throughout the United States. And what I would say is that even in Israel's earliest year, in the context that I described, the challenges that it was facing, Israel's leaders had a choice to make. And it would have been more than reasonable for their leaders to say, we have to turn inwards and we have to look after ourselves. The same thing is true today. It would be more than reasonable for Israel's government and for the Israeli people to say we have to turn inwards and look after only ourselves. And yet that actually hasn't been the response. All of the international development organizations that I profile in my book are still doing this work. It's much harder for them because right now it's much harder to raise money. Most people want to give money for the survivors of October 7th, for evacuees in Israel that have been forced from their homes in the south and in the north. But the determination to do this work, this willingness to do the work, the devotion to the work, that remains unchanged.
Well, that is a true testament to the spirit of Israel. It's always amazed me how much you want to reach out and help other people. And in that, I can't help but point out, Hamas has never helped anyone. Hezbollah has never helped anyone. And I'll put out there, the nation of Iran has never helped anyone. That it all seems to be bent on this death cult. And it's amazing to me the world would rally around them and not rally around Israel. Absent a spiritual explanation that somehow or other evil attracts this kind of support, do you see any reason for that?
I believe that the American people and most people are decent, honest, good people that can tell the difference between right and wrong. And what we need those decent, honest, good people to do is to speak up. And one way that they can speak up is to help the hostages that are still being held in Gaza, 101 people, of which 7 are American, and 4 of whom are believed to be alive. And it's imperative on every single American, on every single decent person, to learn their names and to take up their cause and ensure that we bring them home alive.
In doing documentaries on Israel, one of the amazing things that I've discovered is that even secular Israelis who aren't reading the Tanakh, aren't studying Scripture, are saying just from their innermost being, we are supposed to be a light to the nations. What can the world learn from Israel's leadership in this?
I love that question. I actually divided my book into 4 different chapters. I try to make a case for why Israel is doing this work outside of its borders. As we said, it's an untold story, and as you pointed out, there's no reciprocity. Israel doesn't seem to be benefiting economically or politically, so why does it happen? I think it goes to the core of who Israel and the Jewish people are. So I speak about how the reasons it happens are for what you said, tikkun olam, this idea that we can build a better world, the pragmatism, the simple idea that every person wants to have a better life for their family, for their community, for their society, and for their country. The adventurism, this desire that all of us have to go out into the world to meet and experience new things. And chutzpahism, which is that audacity, that notion that you can look at the world and say the problems are absolutely overwhelming and one person can't make a difference. But I profile people in this book that say we can absolutely make a difference. Look what we've done.
Aviva Kompas, thanks so much for joining with us, and you can be assured we're standing with you. We're standing with Israel in her time of need. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
What a great testimony about Israeli showing resilience and generosity during one of the most difficult times in their history. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. And please keep praying for Israel. for the peace of Jerusalem, for the IDF soldiers and all those caught in harm's way, and for the hostages in Gaza to come home. I'm Chris Mitchell. For all of us here at the Jerusalem Bureau, we'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.